My name is Hannah Wells, and I grew up in a pale yellow house on a quiet street in Burlington, Vermont, a place where the winters were long and the summers felt like a secret gift. That house had a slanted porch, a narrow driveway, and a tiny cherry tree that my mother planted the year I was born. She used to say it would grow up with me. I always liked that idea, and for most of my childhood, I believed everything would stay that simple, just me, my mother Evelyn, and the safety of our little home. But when I turned 15, the world I knew cracked open so fast that sometimes I still feel the pieces shifting. My mother was everything warm in that house. She laughed often, but softly, as if laughter was something precious that needed to be shared gently. She taught at a local elementary school and kept a habit of saving every extra dollar she could find, tucking away small bills into envelopes inside her desk. For Europe, she would say, one day, you and I will see the old streets, the stone bridges, the art, everything they write about in books. We kept a small glass jar labeled London Trip on the top shelf in the kitchen, and whenever she had a few pounds from her past travels, she would drop them inside and smile at the sound. Life felt steady, like nothing could break it. That's why the morning my father told me she was gone didn't make sense at first. He stood in the living room, his shoulders rigid, his hands pressed flat against the kitchen table as if he needed it to stay upright. My father, Gregory, was a man who rarely showed his feelings, but even then, on the day he broke me, there was something empty in his face instead of grief. Hannah, he said, not meeting my eyes, your mother's car went off the road last night. They tried to save her. They couldn't. The words didn't sound real. They didn't even sound like his voice. I remember staring at his mouth, wondering why it wasn't trembling. Why wasn't he crying? Why wasn't he holding me? What do you mean? I asked him. My voice felt small, far away. He repeated it. The same flat tone. The same empty look. I think I waited for him to collapse, to pull me into his arms, to let me bury my face in his shirt and cry until nothing was left. Instead, he stepped aside as if he expected me to walk past him, to continue living because he had already decided that was what I should do. The funeral happened too quickly. It was a closed casket, and even then, nobody questioned it. People said it was because she didn't survive the impact, that it was better for the family this way. I didn't argue. I didn't know how to. My aunts hugged me tightly, my cousins whispered that they were sorry, and neighbors brought casseroles to the house. The cherry tree in the yard bloomed for the first time that year, tiny white flowers opening despite the chill in the air. My mother would have loved it, and that thought alone shattered me all over again. But what I remember most from those days was how the house changed. It wasn't the furniture or the photos or the things that people usually talk about. It was the air. It went cold. My father barely spoke. He spent hours locked in his study, whispering on the phone. When I passed by his door, I heard fragments of conversations, words like documents, accounts, property rights, and numbers that didn't mean anything to me then, $180,000, $220,000, sometimes more. At first, I thought he was dealing with paperwork for the funeral. Adults always talk about confusing things like taxes and insurance when someone dies. But even when the funeral was over and the visitors stopped coming, the calls continued. The envelopes on the table kept piling up. He wasn't grieving, he was working. That didn't make sense to me. My mother had been his wife for 19 years. Shouldn't he be crying somewhere? Shouldn't he be lost in memories? Instead, he looked lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted. That terrified me, even if I didn't know why. Nights became the hardest part. I would sit in my room, staring at the doorway where my mother used to appear, saying my name softly and poking her head inside to check on me. She always smelled like vanilla and chalk dust from her classroom. Now the house smelled like stale coffee and my father's cologne. I cried until my throat hurt, but the tears didn't bring any comfort. They only reminded me how alone I suddenly was. I tried to talk to him once. Just once. Dad, I said, standing in the kitchen doorway. I miss her. He didn't look up from the papers he was signing. We all miss her, Hannah, he said. But life moves forward. You should focus on school. His voice was so flat, so calm, that it made anger rise in my chest. "Do you even care?" I demanded. That made him look at me finally, not with sadness or pain, but with irritation, like I had interrupted something important. "Don't start this," he said. "I don't have time for childish emotion." Childish emotion. My mother had always told me that feelings were what made us human. And here he was calling mine childish. That conversation left a fracture inside me that never fully healed. Over the next few years, I watched my father transform into someone I barely recognized. He bought a new car, a new suit, a new watch worth more than $5,000. He went on trips to other American cities, Dallas, San Francisco, Miami, always for business. But I noticed the envelopes he received from banks grew thicker, and the ones he mailed out went to lawyers' offices. I didn't understand the details then, but I knew something wrong was happening. Something dark. Something connected to my mother's death. I could feel it in my bones, like the way animals sense a storm before the sky darkens. And even though I didn't know the truth yet, I sensed that her death wasn't what he said it was. Her absence felt like a lie, a wrongness, a stolen piece of my life that didn't fit into the world I was now living in. My childhood ended quietly, not with one single moment, but through a series of small, painful realizations that built upon each other like slow, silent heartbreaks. By the time I turned 18, the girl I had been was gone, replaced by someone who watched everything carefully, who didn't trust the silence in a room, who carried a fear she couldn't name. If I had known what was coming next, if I had known that my mother was not dead, that she had been alive for years, hidden away because of what my father had done, I think I would have held my heart tighter. But life doesn't give warnings. It just waits for the right moment to change everything. And for me, that moment was still ahead, waiting quietly. By the time I turned 22, the yellow house in Burlington no longer felt like a home. It had become a building I slept in, nothing more. My father and I moved around each other like strangers passing on a sidewalk. Our conversations were short, controlled, and painfully empty. The air felt heavy, like grief had settled into the walls and refused to leave. But I could never have imagined how quickly that emptiness would be filled with something much worse. It happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn. I remember because the sky outside had turned a deep purple, the kind that comes right before the first snow of the season. I had just come back from my shift at a small bakery on the corner of Montpelier Street, my clothes still smelling faintly of cinnamon and warm dough. I pushed open the front door expecting silence, but instead, laughter spilled out from the living room. Sharp, unfamiliar laughter. I froze. My father stood there, not in his usual brown work jacket, but in a crisp navy suit. And beside him was a woman I had never seen before. She wore a fitted red coat with a fur collar, and her dark blonde hair was pulled into a sleek twist. She looked like she belonged in a hotel lobby in Charlotte, North Carolina, not in our creaky Vermont living room. "Hannah," my father said, clearing his throat as if rehearsing the moment, "this is Vivian Clark." The woman stepped forward, smiling with a confidence that made the room feel smaller. "Hello, sweetheart," she said. "I've heard so much about you." Sweetheart. I clenched my jaw. My father's next words hit me like a blow. "We got married this afternoon," he said, his eyes flicking away from mine. "At the courthouse in Albany, New York." I blinked, unsure if I had misheard him. "Married? Today?" Vivian lifted her hand, showing off a ring that sparkled too brightly under the overhead light. "It was very sudden, but when you know, she said with a playful laugh. I looked at my father, searching for the man who used to smile when my mother baked pie, or who used to read to me on the porch steps. He wasn't there. This man had a straightened posture, a polished watch, and a stranger's calmness. Nothing in him belonged to the life we once had. Vivian walked through the house like she had already memorized its layout. She ran her hand along the wooden banister, peeked into the kitchen, and wrinkled her nose at the patterned curtains my mother had sewn herself. "This place is quaint," she said carefully, "but it needs a fresh touch." By fresh touch, I instantly understood what she meant, my mother's memory. Everything she touched, everything she chose, every quiet piece of her still living in this house was now an obstacle. The next few weeks were a storm. Vivian moved quickly. She replaced the curtains with pale gray ones. She packed my mother's teacups into boxes, without asking me. She threw out the floral rug in a hallway, saying it was too old-fashioned. She hung abstract art on the walls and brought in chrome lamps and glass bowls that didn't belong in a cozy Vermont house. Suddenly, everything felt cold, metallic, and unfriendly. The worst moment was when I noticed my favorite photo missing, the one where my mother and I were sitting under the cherry tree, laughing as the petals fell around us. I found it in a cardboard box labeled Old Items. Vivian's handwriting was neat, almost elegant. I showed it to my father. "Dad, why is this in storage?" He didn't look up from the newspaper. "It's time to make the house look new. Let it go, Hannah. Let it go." As if memories were cheap decorations that could be tossed out. Vivian's presence spread through the house like perfume, sweet at first, then overwhelming. She had an opinion about everything I did. The way I folded laundry. The way I stacked dishes. The way I left my phone on the table. One evening, she found me studying on the living room couch and sighed loudly. "You're nearly an adult, Hannah. Don't you think it's time you learned to contribute? Utilities aren't free." I turned slowly. "I'm still in school. I work part-time." I thought, Dad, and I agreed that school comes first. Vivian smiled, but not kindly. "It's not my fault you're still living like a child. Most young women your age have their own place. This isn't Europe. In America, independence is expected." My father, who had been listening from the kitchen, didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. His silence told me everything. A few days later, I walked in from my shift at the bakery, the smell of baguette still clinging to my clothes, and immediately knew something was wrong. The house smelled of paint, sharp and chemical. Vivian stood in the hallway, arms crossed, while a painter rolled pale cream paint over the soft yellow walls my mother once picked. "What's happening?" I asked. "Updating," Vivian said. The old color was depressing. "This is brighter. More modern." I felt something inside me tighten. "You could have at least asked." "This isn't your decision to make," she replied. "And frankly, it's time you started thinking about where you're going to live next." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" My father appeared behind her, and the moment he opened his mouth, my heart slid down into my stomach. "We've talked," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's time for you to find your own place." I laughed, thinking it had to be a misunderstanding. "What?" "Dad, I can't afford rent on my own. I only make about $1,200 a month. You know that." Vivian shrugged. "Plenty of people start with less. You'll manage." My father stepped closer, his face expressionless. "You're 22, Hannah. You're grown. You can't rely on us forever. You have 1 month to move out." 1 month. My voice cracked. "Dad, please. I have nowhere to go." He didn't flinch. "You'll figure it out." Just like that, the last piece of my childhood collapsed. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the half-empty room. I had $460 in my savings account. My textbooks alone cost more than that. I felt betrayed in a way I couldn't put into words. I remembered my mother's soft voice, her gentle hands braiding my hair, her warm laugh filling the kitchen. Everything she built in this house had been erased, and now I was being erased too. On the final night before I left, I stood at the edge of the driveway. Snowflakes floated around me, settling on the bare branches of the cherry tree my mother planted. I touched its trunk, remembering how she once told me it would grow as long as it was loved. It didn't feel loved now. I turned back toward the house one last time. The windows glowed with warm light, but nothing inside that house belonged to me anymore. "Are you sure?" I whispered into the cold air, hoping my father might suddenly change his mind. But no one came outside. No one called my name. No one stopped me. So I walked away, pulling my suitcase through the snow, feeling as if the ground beneath me had finally disappeared completely. And in that moment, I didn't know that the biggest shock of my life was still waiting for me, just one phone call away. The morning after I left my childhood home in Burlington, I woke up in a small apartment in Rochester, New York, on the uncomfortable couch of my friend Maddie Turner. Maddie was one of those rare people who didn't ask many questions. You could show up at her door with swollen eyes and 2 suitcases, and she'd simply hand you a pillow and say, "Stay as long as you need." Her kindness felt like a blanket over my bruised heart. But even with that comfort, I barely slept. My thoughts kept circling the same painful loop. My father's cold voice, Vivian's smirk, the empty place where my mother should have been. The air in the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. I blinked at the ceiling, my body heavy and stiff. My mind felt like it was floating in murky water. I tried to take a deep breath, but it snagged in my chest. Everything felt wrong, as if my life had slipped out of its own skin. Then my phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet with sharp urgency. I reached for it, expecting it to be Maddie or maybe the bakery asking if I could pick up an extra shift. But the screen showed a number from Cleveland, Ohio. A hospital number. My heart lurched. "Hello." My voice was thin, shaky. A woman answered. Her tone was calm but not warm, professional, as if she had spoken these types of sentences hundreds of times before. "Is this Hannah Wells?" "Yes," I said, sitting upright. "This is Hannah. We're calling from Riverside Medical Center in Cleveland. We have a patient who specifically requested to speak with you." A chill moved through me. "Who?" The woman hesitated, and that hesitation terrified me more than anything. "It's your mother," she said slowly. "She's alive, Hannah, and she needs to see you." I froze for several seconds. Everything in the room seemed to tilt. The couch under me, the air around me, my own breath. "My mother is dead," I whispered. "She died 7 years ago." "My father, I understand what you were told," the woman said gently. "But your mother is alive. She asked for you by name. She wants to speak to you as soon as possible. Can you come?" The phone slipped in my sweaty palm. My first instinct was anger, because this had to be a mistake or a cruel joke. Then confusion twisted into hope, and hope twisted into fear. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. "I'll come," I finally managed. When the call ended, I just sat there, staring at the wall as if it could explain everything. My throat closed around the rush of emotions fighting to rise. Joy, disbelief, hurt, longing. It was too much. Maddie came out of her room rubbing her eyes, and when she saw my face, she sat down beside me without asking anything. I told her the truth in a trembling voice no daughter should ever have to speak. "My mother is alive." She gasped softly, but didn't interrupt. When I finished, she squeezed my hand. "You need to go, Hannah. Now." I checked my wallet. I had $58, barely enough for gas if I borrowed Maddie's old car. She insisted on giving me another $40, and though I hated taking it, she wouldn't let me refuse. She even packed a small bag of snacks for the 4-hour drive. The road from Rochester to Cleveland felt longer than any stretch I'd ever traveled. The bare winter trees blurred past, and every mile seemed to tighten the knot in my stomach. I kept imagining 100 different scenarios. None of them made sense. If my mother had been alive all these years, why hadn't she come home? Why hadn't she called me? Why would my father lie? Had he really lied? Or was this some terrible misunderstanding? But deep down, something inside me already knew the truth. That quiet instinct, the same one that had whispered for years that something was wrong, was now screaming. By the time I reached the hospital parking lot, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The building's tall windows reflected the cloudy Ohio sky. People hurried in and out through the sliding doors, carrying bags, pushing wheelchairs, living normal moments in a place where life and death collided every day. I walked into the main entrance, my stomach twisting. The woman at the front desk recognized my name instantly and guided me through a long hallway that smelled of antiseptic and faint soap. The floor tiles felt too bright under the fluorescent lights. "She's just down here," the nurse said. We stopped outside a pale blue door. She gave me a soft, encouraging smile. "Take your time." I reached for the handle, with trembling fingers. When I pushed the door open, the first thing I saw was a fragile figure sitting propped up in the hospital bed. Her hair was lighter than I remembered. Her face was thinner, but her eyes, those gentle, warm, familiar eyes, were exactly the same. "Hannah," she whispered. My knees nearly buckled. I crossed the room in seconds. "Mom," my voice cracked on the word. "Mom, you're alive." She opened her arms, and I collapsed into them. She smelled faintly of hospital soap and something faintly floral, something that tugged at an old memory. Tears poured down my face, soaking the blanket. She stroked my hair just like she used to. "My baby girl," she murmured. "I missed you every single day." I pulled back just enough to see her face.
How?
"How are you alive?" Dad said. "He said you were gone. We had a funeral." "Mom, why didn't you come home?" Her eyes filled with tears, not soft tears, but heavy ones that carried years of pain.
Your father lied, she said.
And I hid because I had no other choice. She told me everything. She told me about the night of her so-called accident, how she found financial documents proving that my father was trying to transfer her property and savings into his name. She confronted him. They fought. He left the house in anger. Hours later, when she drove to clear her mind, her brakes failed. She crashed hard into a barrier, but she survived barely. At the hospital, a young nurse overheard my father on the phone talking about getting everything soon and finalizing accounts. Suspicious, the nurse told my mother what she had heard. Doctors noted unusual tampering in the brake system. My mother realized the truth. My father had tried to kill her for money.
He thought I was dead, she said.
And I let him believe it, because if he knew I was alive, he would try again. My breath caught. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you take me with you?" Her face crumpled. "I thought maybe he would be good to you." I watched from a distance. I had a little money saved in London, about £3,000 he didn't know about. It kept me safe. But when I heard he kicked you out, I knew then what he really was. She reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "That's why I called you, and why I called the police." I sat beside her, holding her hand like it was the only anchor in a storm. My father's betrayal, my mother's pain, the truth hidden for years, it all crashed through me at once. The life I thought I knew was gone. But for the first time since I was 15, something warm sparked inside the empty space. My mother was alive, and we were going to face the truth together. The days after the truth came out passed in a strange haze, as if time moved differently inside Riverside Medical Center. I spent every morning and night beside my mother's bed, trying to absorb the reality that she was alive, breathing, speaking, everything my father had sworn she wasn't. I felt anger and relief twisting inside me, but mostly I felt a quiet determination growing stronger each day. A few mornings later, a man in a dark gray suit walked into her hospital room. He carried a leather folder and introduced himself as Richard Hale, an attorney from Columbus, Ohio. "Your mother asked me to take on the case," he said, sitting beside us. "There's a lot to uncover, but you two will not face this alone." His calm voice steadied something inside me. For the first time in years, an adult stood on our side. Over the next week, detectives and hospital staff moved through the room like steady waves. My mother told them everything, how she found my father's documents, how the brakes were tampered with, how the nurse warned her, and how she used a small savings account in London with barely £2,500 to disappear. She answered every question with honesty, though I could see how much each memory hurt her. When the police finally arrested my father, we received the news from Officer Ramirez, a kind woman from Cleveland PD. "He didn't resist," she said softly. "He knew why we were there." A strange sadness settled in my chest. I didn't want him back in my life, but hearing he went so quietly made everything feel more real and more painful. The trial took place in Toledo, Ohio, inside a tall courthouse that smelled faintly of old paper and cold stone. Reporters waited outside with flashing cameras. I held my mother's hand as we walked in. She looked small but unbroken, leaning on the cane the hospital gave her. My father sat at the defense table, wearing a navy suit I recognized. He avoided my gaze completely. When he finally lifted his head and saw my mother alive for the first time in 7 years, his expression didn't soften or harden. It simply froze, as if he couldn't compute the truth standing so close to him. Witness after witness stepped forward. The nurse, Lydia Porter, testified about overhearing his suspicious phone call. A mechanic explained the brake tampering, showing photos of the damaged lines. A financial expert laid out every dollar he gained by declaring my mother dead, over $210,000 in assets and insurance. When my turn came, my legs felt heavy. But I forced myself to speak. I told the court how he told me she was gone, how he never let me see her body, how quickly he changed our home, remarried, and pushed me out as if I were nothing. I didn't cry while speaking. I saved the tears for later, when the courtroom was silent again. Then my mother testified. She stood with her shoulders back, her voice steady. I hid because I wanted to live, she said. But when he threw our daughter out, I knew I had to come forward. Her words echoed through the room long after she finished. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, my breath caught. For attempted murder, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of deception, the judge said, Greg Wells is hereby sentenced to 32 years in prison. 32 years, the courtroom didn't cheer. There was no celebration. But the weight on my chest lifted, piece by piece. My mother and I left Ohio soon after and moved to Bend, Oregon, where the air felt cleaner and the mountains seemed to protect us. We rented a small apartment with soft light and quiet mornings. My mother placed $40,000 of her recovered money into an account for me, something to help rebuild my future. Every night, we sat together on our balcony, watching the sun dip behind the hills. We didn't talk much at first, but the silence between us was warm now, not empty. I used to believe my story ended the day my father pushed me out of that house. But sitting there with my mother alive beside me, I understood something new. That day wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of getting my life back, and this time, I wasn't facing it alone.